A mushroom got classified alongside heroin. Not because it kills people, because it made them question everything. That's the real story, and once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. We're not talking about the drugs are bad PSA you got in school. We're talking about how a naturally occurring fungus collided with governments, spy agencies, and the entire psychiatric establishment, and lost. Not because the science was bad, because the implications were terrifying to the people in charge. Long before any of this, indigenous communities in Mexico, the Mazatec, the Mixtec, and others had been using psilocybin mushrooms in sacred ceremonies for centuries. They called them flesh of the gods. These weren't recreational. They were tools for healing, for spiritual reckoning, for communal meaning. The knowledge was ancient, passed down, carefully held. Then a banker named R. Gordon Wasson flew down in the 1950s, sat in on one of these ceremonies, and wrote about it in Life magazine. That single article cracked the door open. Western science walked through it, looked around, and proceeded to take the whole thing apart. Indigenous healers weren't credited. They weren't funded. They weren't consulted. Instead, the compounds were extracted, synthesized in European labs, and handed to researchers who reframed thousands of years of sacred practice as raw material for clinical trials. That power imbalance didn't happen accidentally. It set the tone for everything that came after. If you're new here and you want more deep dives like this, subscribe now. New videos drop weekly and the topics only get more layered from here. By the late 1950s, psilocybin research was not underground. It was in peer-reviewed journals. It had government funding. Psychiatrists were using it to treat chronic alcoholism and reporting results that stunned them. Patients who had failed every other treatment were quitting after a single guided session. Not because the drug rewired their chemistry, because something about the experience shifted how they saw themselves. That's a harder thing to measure and a much harder thing to control. Researchers started noticing patterns they couldn't explain cleanly. People emerged from sessions reporting less fear of death, more empathy, a softening of the rigid personality structures that had kept them stuck. The psychiatric world was staring at data its own instruments couldn't fully process. You can measure serotonin, you can't measure feeling forgiven by the universe. That gap between what science could quantify and what patients were actually reporting became the fault line the whole field kept falling into. Then the government got interested, for very different reasons. The CIA launched Project MKUltra in 1953. The official goal was to develop tools for interrogation and psychological manipulation during the Cold War. The unofficial result was that a chemist named Sidney Gottlieb started distributing LSD to universities, hospitals, prisons, and cultural organizations, sometimes without anyone's knowledge or consent. Prisoners received repeated high doses for months. Psychiatric patients were dosed without warning. The program wanted a truth serum, something to make people compliant. It didn't work. The substances had the opposite effect on a lot of subjects. Instead of becoming more obedient, people became more introspective, more questioning. That was the problem. A drug that makes someone examine their beliefs and loyalties is a terrible tool for control. But the information was already out. The seeding had already happened. By trying to weaponize these substances, the CIA inadvertently introduced them to the exact researchers and cultural circles that would carry them into the 1960s. When MKUltra files leaked in the 1970s, the public reaction wasn't just outrage at the lack of consent. It confirmed something a lot of people already suspected. Governments weren't afraid these drugs would harm bodies. They were afraid of what happened to minds. The 1960s took everything that had been happening in controlled rooms and blew the doors off. Psychedelics spread from universities into music, art, and political organizing. People who had sessions reported feeling less attached to fixed roles, consumer habits, and authority structures. Anti-war movements and psychedelic culture started overlapping in ways that made officials deeply uncomfortable. The fear wasn't intoxication. A drunk soldier still follows orders. Someone who has genuinely questioned why the hierarchy exists at all is a different situation. One person accelerated the collapse faster than almost anyone else. Timothy Leary started as a legitimate Harvard researcher. His early work on guided psilocybin sessions inside prisons showed real reductions in reoffending rates. The data was credible. Then he shifted. He started publicly encouraging people to use psychedelics outside any clinical context whatsoever. Turn on, tune in, drop out became his motto and became the government's greatest gift. Every serious researcher trying to maintain credibility inside institutions watched Leary hand opponents exactly the ammunition they needed. He wasn't wrong that these experiences had value outside a lab, but the moment he became a cultural figurehead, the conversation stopped being about evidence and started being about him. Funding dried up faster. Administrators distanced themselves. Leary's visibility didn't just hurt his own career. It gave the crackdown a face to point at and a story to tell the public. Media did the work governments needed. Instead of covering the clinical research still producing legitimate results, headlines focused on dramatic outliers, bad trips, accidents, crimes with tenuous connections to substance use. The hippie caricature became a political tool. Once you've successfully painted a group as irresponsible and childish, you don't have to engage with anything they actually believe. Their ideas about war, conformity, or spiritual freedom get dismissed along with them. Scientists who privately had profound research findings stopped defending them publicly. The stigma spread from the culture to the science. By the early 1970s, psilocybin was placed in Schedule 1, the most restrictive legal category alongside heroin. Official position: no accepted medical use. High potential for abuse. Research funding collapsed overnight. Ethics boards became hostile to any proposal touching the subject. Young scientists were quietly advised to stay away from it if they wanted careers. Entire lines of inquiry into depression, trauma, and end-of-life distress were abandoned mid-development. Patients who might have benefited from those treatments never got them. An entire generation grew up with no memory that any of this research had ever existed. Not because it was disproven, because it was buried. Small underground networks kept working quietly with no institutional support, preserving techniques and observations that wouldn't reappear in academic journals for decades. That knowledge had nowhere to go, so it waited. The thaw started in the late 1990s. A few researchers convinced regulators to allow tightly controlled human trials again. The framing was careful, deliberate, and strategic. These were potential medicines for treatment-resistant conditions. The language of spirituality, community, and worldview change was set aside in favor of clinical precision. Brain scans, depression scales, standardized dosing. The results were striking. Patients with life-threatening cancer who had guided psilocybin sessions reported dramatic reductions in death anxiety. The effects lasted months from a single experience. People with depression who had failed multiple medications showed rapid improvement. Imaging studies linked psilocybin to changes in brain networks associated with rigid, repetitive thinking, which aligned with what patients described as feeling unstuck for the first time in years. The specific network getting disrupted is called the default mode network. It's the part of the brain responsible for your internal monologue, your sense of self, your habit of replaying the past and rehearsing the future. In people with depression, trauma, or addiction, that network tends to be overactive and locked into loops. Psilocybin appears to temporarily quiet it, not erase it, but loosen its grip enough for new connections to form. Neuroscientists describe it as a kind of snow globe effect. You shake the brain's usual patterns up, and during the settling, something reorganizes. That reorganization, when it happens in a supported environment with trained guides, is where the therapeutic value seems to live. The brain isn't being damaged. It's being given a window to work differently. The research was solid. The difference this time was who controlled the story. Modern psilocybin therapy is channeled through clinical trials, regulatory pathways, and medical institutions. Access is mediated by doctors and high-cost treatment programs. The framing is individualized. Fix your depression. Reduce your death anxiety. The broader implications, the ones about consumerism, obedience, and the meaning of work, are not a part of the pitch. Societies, it turns out, are far more comfortable with the substance when its disruptive potential is aimed at individual symptoms rather than collective systems. Outside clinical settings, something else is moving in parallel. Cities like Denver and states like Oregon have begun decriminalizing or regulating psilocybin access outside the traditional pharmaceutical pipeline. These aren't full legalizations. They're cautious experiments in what a non-medicalized, community-centered framework could look like. Whether they survive long enough to build real infrastructure or get rolled back the moment political winds shift is still an open question. The pattern of history suggests the answer depends less on the evidence and more on how threatening the results turn out to be. There's a version of this where that's purely pragmatic, get the foot in the door, prove safety, expand access later. There's another version where the same insight that once threatened institutional power is now being repackaged as a premium wellness product available to whoever can afford a clinical session. The molecule didn't change. The story around it did. The pattern across this entire history is almost mechanical. A tool that helps people examine their own minds and question inherited assumption surfaces. Institutions find it threatening. Ridicule and criminalization follow. The knowledge goes underground. Eventually it returns, rebranded in terms the establishment can tolerate, and the cycle starts again. The most consistent source of harm was never the substance itself. It was the absence of context. Bad trips, lasting damage, reckless use. These came from unprepared people in unsupported settings, from secret government experiments with no consent, from a complete collapse of any educational framework around responsible use. The molecule wasn't the problem. The environment around it was. So what does that tell you about every other idea or tool that gets laughed at, criminalized, or quietly buried? Who benefits from the forgetting? And what are you curious about right now that you've already been trained to dismiss? The most dangerous ideas aren't the loud ones. They're the ones that make people think for themselves. And the real story was never about a mushroom. It was about who gets to decide what thinking is allowed.